Ask most people to name a royal residence, and they'll picture the glittering gates of Buckingham Palace, or perhaps the turrets of Windsor Castle glinting in morning fog. But those are only the visible emblems of monarchy, the ones meant for postcards and television screens. Beyond them lies another Britain entirely, a private realm of over 30 estates, castles, and manors stretching from Norfolk to the Scottish Highlands. Their combined worth, billions, their true purpose, carefully concealed behind centuries of custom and the soft vocabulary of tradition. To the public, these are symbols of continuity. To accountants, they are riddles. To historians, they are a window into how power survives long after politics fade. The Windsors call them homes, the Treasury calls them exemptions, and the public calls them, well, nothing at all, because most have never been seen. This is Old Thank You Aim Docs. Tonight, we peel back the myths and open the gates, not to Buckingham or Windsor, but to the hidden properties the Crown prefers to keep unseen, and ask, quietly, what their walls are really protecting. Every Christmas, the cameras catch the same familiar ritual. The royal family walking to church at Sandringham, smiling, waving, dressed in their winter best. It looks wholesome, almost ordinary. The image of a family rooted in tradition. But the truth is, Sandringham isn't a symbol of simplicity. It's a symbol of how tradition itself can be used as camouflage. Behind those soft images of snow and hymns lies a 20,000-acre estate, 270 rooms, private shooting grounds, tenant farms, and woodlands, a world that the public sees only through the lens of ceremony. The estate was purchased in 1862 by the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, for what would now be about £200 million. It has been passed from monarch to monarch ever since, privately, and therefore beyond the reach of inheritance tax. When Queen Elizabeth died, Charles received it not through legal inheritance, but through arrangement. No tax, no audit, no questions asked. Sandringham is said to fund itself through farming and tourism, but only the ground floor and gardens open to the public, and only when the family isn't there. The rest is closed, permanently. That closure is not about security, it's about control. In Britain, even the grandest estates often open their doors to justify the tax reliefs that keep them alive. Sandringham doesn't need to. Its maintenance comes, directly or indirectly, from the Duchy of Lancaster, the monarch's private income, which itself exists because of royal privilege. So when the lights glow behind those Jacobean windows each December, the electricity is paid for by an income stream that began with royal power centuries ago. The estate also carries another, quieter tradition, the royal shoot. For over a century, Sandringham has been one of Britain's premier game-shooting estates. Pheasants are raised, driven, and shot by select guests. Princes and dukes, aristocrats and bankers, all gathered in the frosty dawn. The invitations are private, the conversations unrecorded. It is here, away from the public eye, that the family network of influence is renewed each winter. No reporters, no accountability, just the soft thud of gunfire echoing across the Norfolk fields. To ordinary Britons, that ritual seems harmless. Sport, tradition, heritage, but it serves another purpose. It maintains the invisible chain between monarchy and class, between royal favour and those who benefit from its shadow. The secrecy around Sandringham isn't about danger, it's about mystique. If the public ever saw the scale of that estate, if they walked through its 270 rooms, the idea of a normal royal Christmas would collapse instantly. Even the numbers are abstracted into comfort. 20,000 acres sounds poetic, until you remember that's 31 square miles, larger than many towns. And yet, it belongs to one family, who already have homes in London, Scotland, and beyond. Ask why one family needs that much land, and you touch the raw nerve of British monarchy itself, the merger of property and identity. To challenge one is to challenge the other. Still, the illusion endures. Christmas smiles, televised walks. A story Britain tells itself about continuity and grace. But Sandringham isn't continuity. It's insulation, a fortress built of nostalgia, a reminder that in Britain, tradition often survives because no one is allowed to see what it costs to preserve. And that, perhaps, is why the cameras always stop at the gate. If Sandringham is the royal family's winter sanctuary, then Balmoral is their fortress of summer and of silence. It stretches across 50,000 acres of the Scottish Highlands, larger than the entire city of Cambridge, and worth well over £1 billion. It is where Queen Elizabeth spent her happiest months and where she died. In September of 2022, Balmoral is not merely a castle, it is a declaration carved in granite, a place built to look eternal and to remind Scotland that the Crown's roots reach into its soil. Queen Victoria first fell in love with the Highlands in the 1840s, the mist, the solitude, the mountains that seemed to touch the heavens. She and Prince Albert bought Balmoral in 1852, tore down the old building, and replaced it with a baronial fantasy. Turrets, towers, tartan walls, all chosen by Albert High himself. It was not just a home, it was theatre. Every stone was a statement. The monarchy could be modern, sentimental, and Scottish, at least in appearance. The result was stunning, romantic, and deeply political. For generations, Balmoral has served as the monarchy's northern refuge and its most powerful stage. When the family arrives each August, local roads are sealed, the press kept far away, and the estate becomes a sovereign island. Officially, those weeks are about rest and privacy. In truth, they are about control. The walls may be granite, but they're built to contain perception. At Balmoral, no photographer can catch a frown. No journalist can overhear the private negotiations that shape the royal image for the year ahead. Every visit is both retreat and reset. Maintaining this illusion costs millions annually. Gardeners, gamekeepers, housekeepers, foresters, and a permanent staff of around 50 who live and work on the estate year-round. None of this appears in the sovereign grant. It's all paid from private funds, which themselves come from the Duchy of Lancaster, the ancient portfolio that quietly bridges royal duty and private profit for a property closed to the public nearly all year. Balmoral's financial opacity is almost absolute. And yet, for Scotland, the symbolism runs deeper than money. The estate was Victoria's gesture of affection or appropriation, depending on whom you ask. It wrapped the monarchy in the romance of Highland culture, just as Scotland's independence movements were losing strength. Today, as that debate rises again, Balmoral stands as a paradox, a castle that both flatters Scottish pride and reminds it who owns the land. The tartan curtains and Highland games are not mere pageantry, they are the performance of unity. King Charles may not love Balmoral the way his mother did. He prefers nearby Birkhall, smaller, more human in scale, but he cannot abandon Balmoral. To do so would be to abandon the symbol itself, and so the estate will endure, vast and underused, closed to most of the nation whose loyalty it still quietly demands. Only a fraction of its ballroom and gardens open for a few weeks each year. The rest, the forests, the moors, the rivers, remain unseen. That is the genius of royal secrecy. It hides excess in plain sight, wrapping it in romance. Balmoral is not just where the monarch retreats. It's where monarchy renews its claim to permanence. But permanence is fragile. Tradition lasts only as long as people believe in its meaning. And the further the public drifts from the idea of monarchy, the more these granite walls begin to feel like monuments to distance, not devotion. Not every royal mansion inspires reverence. The family would rather the public simply forget. 7 miles from Windsor Castle stands Fort Belvedere, a Gothic folly built in the 1750s, small by royal standards, but immense in its consequences. It was here, in December of 1936, that King Edward VIII signed his abdication papers, ending a reign undone by love. The story is legendary. A king who gave up his crown for Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American who would never be queen. But after that signature, Fort Belvedere became something else, a scar. No royal has lived there since. For decades it stood empty, unwanted, as if the building itself carried contagion. Today it's quietly leased to a private family. The terms are confidential, the walls remain silent. The royal family rarely mentions its name. It's strange how history repeats itself, wearing new clothes. 8 decades later, another royal couple sought freedom from the same institution. Harry and Meghan, newlyweds, gifted Frogmore Cottage in 2019. The cottage sat on the Windsor estate, a modest-sounding name for a house that cost £2.5 million to renovate, paid for by the sovereign grant, taxpayer money. Less than a year after moving in, they left for California, and the scandal that followed echoed through the press like an old refrain. A royal property, a public bill, and a narrative of betrayal. Harry repaid the renovation costs after the outcry, but not the security expenses, nor the hidden upkeep that still came from public funds. The house then stood empty, a symbol of how tightly monarchy and money remain entwined, even in the age of Instagram. Both Fort Belvedere and Frogmore reveal the same fracture line running through royal history. When private desire collides with public duty, the building itself becomes the witness. In both cases, walls meant to protect privacy ended up preserving scandal, and the pattern never changes. The silence, the secrecy, the vanishing of financial details behind personal arrangements. Officially, these are private homes, yet the public pays, one way or another, through tax exemptions, through the duchies, through security budgets that never see daylight. There's something almost Shakespearean about it. Every generation of Windsors faces the same temptation: to live freely, to love whom they choose, to control their own lives. And every generation discovers the same cost. Freedom means losing the crown's protection. Those who leave become cautionary tales. Those who stay learn to make peace with illusion. Harry and Meghan's story, for all its modern gloss, is simply Edward and Wallis retold, with better lighting and global media. But if Fort Belvedere is the house of abdication, and Frogmore is the house of exit, what they truly expose is the monarchy's inability to evolve without breaking something sacred. A system built on secrecy cannot adapt to a world built on exposure. The walls may still stand, but they no longer keep the world out, only the truth in. When Prince William and Catherine married in 2011, they were presented as the dawn of a modern monarchy. Young, relatable, the future made flesh. And yet, their gift from the Queen told a different story. Anmer Hall, a 10-bedroom Georgian country house nestled within the Sandringham estate, had once belonged to the Duke and Duchess of Kent. For the new Prince and Princess of Wales, it was refurbished at a cost estimated between £1.5 and £3 million. funded through the Duchy of Cornwall, the same ancient estate that for centuries has underwritten royal privilege. The family lived their full thank you from 2015 to 2017, while William served as an air ambulance pilot. To the public, it was the picture of balance, duty and normalcy. But the reality was anything but normal. Anmer Hall is vast, secluded, and guarded. Even its renovations remain undisclosed. No official photographs of the interior. No financial transparency. No mention of the costs beyond the vaguest duchy accounting. The stated reason is privacy for the children, a motive few would question. Yet, beneath that justification lies a deeper pattern. Privacy as a permanent shield, allowing royal wealth to remain unexamined under the guise of parental care. It's a narrative the palace has learned to perfect, show the image of wholesome family life, and the public forgets to ask who funds the walls surrounding it. The Duchy of Cornwall, often described as a private estate, is in truth a relic of medieval privilege. Its revenues, over £20 million annually, exist solely because of royal birthright. When that income funds renovations, it blurs the line between private luxury and public inheritance. Every modern reform promised by the monarchy collides with this contradiction. A family that claims to be ordinary, yet draws wealth from extraordinary arrangements. Highgrove House, King Charles's beloved residence in Gloucestershire, mirrors this duality. Purchased in 1980 for £750,000 through the same Duchy of Cornwall, its value has since risen to over £5 million. Its gardens, designed by Charles himself, are celebrated worldwide. Open to visitors by appointment, a gesture often cited as proof of transparency. But those tours are carefully choreographed. Guests see the roses, the water meadows, the gentle Englishness of it all, yet never step inside the house. Never glimpse the life behind the lattice. The image is curated, the access monetized, the reality preserved behind hedges. When Charles ascended the throne, Highgrove should have passed to William as the new Duke of Cornwall. Instead, Charles retained it through a private arrangement never fully explained. Technically, the duchy now belongs to his son, but the father continues to enjoy its crown jewel. In any other context, this might be called a conflict of interest. In monarchy, it is simply tradition. That word again. The velvet curtain behind which power rearranges itself. Both Anmer and Highgrove embody the paradox of the modern royal. They preach simplicity, yet live within the architecture of inherited grandeur. They speak of duty, yet dwell in estates maintained by the silent machinery of privilege. To their credit, both Charles and William have tried to modernize the monarchy's image, but image cannot reform structure. The duchies still flow as they always have. The secrecy remains. The lawns stay immaculate. And so, the myth of the slimmed-down monarchy persists. Slimer in ceremony, not in substance. The palaces remain. Only the excuses change. Perhaps that's why every promise of reform feels less like revolution and more like renovation. A fresh coat of paint on walls built to endure forever. Every royal house tells a story, and in the Windsor family, those stories unfold like variations on a theme. 3 siblings, 3 homes, 3 versions of duty and privilege. Each claims a different balance between work and comfort, modesty and excess, yet together. They reveal the same unbroken pattern. That in the monarchy, property is never just property. It is identity, insulation, and inheritance, all at once. Let's begin in the Highlands, where King Charles retreats not to Balmoral's monumental castle, but to Hall, a white Georgian manor about 15 miles away, purchased by his grandmother, the Queen Mother, in the 1930s. It passed to Higham in 2002 after her death. Smaller, softer, more human in scale. Birk Hall feels almost pastoral compared to Balmoral's cold granite. It's where Charles and Camilla honeymooned, where they spend their private summers now, far from tourists, far from protocol. There are no official photographs of the interior, no televised tours, only the occasional carefully staged image. The king, reading by a window, the queen tending flowers. In truth, Birk Hall is what the monarchy calls private life, which, in royal vocabulary, means a life beyond accountability. Its boundaries and ownership are deliberately opaque, its value never confirmed, its staff uncounted. To the world, its serenity. To accountants, it's an enigma. Contrast that with Bagshot Park, home to Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, a Victorian mansion on 51 acres, leased to them from the Crown Estate for 99 years beginning in 1999. Officially, they paid £5 million for the lease, but the exact terms remain confidential. The house contains 57 rooms, including the famed Indian billiard room. Its carved teak walls gifted by Indian princes in the 19th century. A house this size costs hundreds of thousands a year to maintain. The Crown Estate pays for the structure. Edward covers interiors and utilities. What does that mean in practice? No one knows. The public can only speculate whether that arrangement favours the Crown or the Crown's family. When asked why he needs so many rooms, Edward once quipped that he uses part of the home for his production company. Perhaps true, but even his own documentaries haven't shed light on Bagshot's financials. And then there's Gatcombe Park, home to Princess Anne, the one royal whose reputation remains almost untarnished. Purchased for her in 1976 with Duchy of Lancaster funds, it sits on 730 acres of working farmland. The house itself is Georgian, comfortable but unpretentious. 12 bedrooms, modest staff, cattle graze the fields, and Anne herself often rides through the mud before breakfast. She's long been called the hardest working royal, often performing over 500 engagements a year. Unlike her brothers, she earns little public criticism, perhaps because her estate feels less like a palace and more like a livelihood, an echo of an older, steadier Britain. And yet, even Gatcombe was bought with duchy funds, money derived not from personal industry, but from the institution of monarchy itself. Its tax advantages mirror those of the grander houses. The difference is one of optics, not structure. Together, these three properties draw a map of royal psychology. Charles retreats inward, seeking intimacy, cloaked in secrecy. Edward enjoys privilege with little scrutiny. Anne finds purpose in work and restraint. Different temperaments, same immunity. Their homes reflect not rebellion against the system, but accommodation within it. Even Anne, being the most practical among them, benefits from a structure that shields royal wealth from normal taxation. Duty softens perception, but not reality. If there is a moral here, it's that privilege adapts. It finds ways to seem respectable, industrious, even virtuous, while remaining protected by the invisible clauses of birthright. The Windsors don't flaunt their wealth the way modern billionaires do. They preserve it through subtlety, leases, trusts, duchies, and the delicate art of saying nothing. And that quietness, more than any crown or scepter, is what keeps the system alive. Some royal properties are hidden by geography, others by shame, and none illustrates that more completely than Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion set deep within Windsor Great Park. surrounded by nearly 100 acres of manicured quiet. It was once the home of the Queen Mother, filled with laughter, picnics, and corgis. Today, it stands as a monument to something far less charming: the monarchy's inability to hold its own members accountable. In 2003, the lease for Royal Lodge was granted to Prince Andrew. 75 years, at a rent of just £250 a week, less than the cost of a one-bedroom flat in London. In exchange, he was required to fund the renovations and maintenance himself. The house needed work. Certainly, it had been neglected since his grandmother's death, but the renovations cost an estimated £7.5 million. Andrew's personal income at the Thank You came largely from a modest naval pension and minor royal stipends. The question practically asks itself, where did the money come from? Some reports hinted at private help from the Queen, others whispered about undisclosed business deals. The truth, as always, disappeared behind family finances, a phrase as impenetrable as the palace gates themselves. What is clear is that Royal Lodge was reborn into luxury: chandeliers, formal gardens, the kind of opulence that would have made Victorian courtiers blush. And then came the fall. The Epstein scandal stripped Andrew of his titles, of his patronages, his public life. In any other family, disgrace of that magnitude might mean losing the house as well. But the lease remains ironclad, a legal document shielding Higham from even the king's displeasure. Charles has reportedly urged his brother to vacate the property, offering Frogmore Cottage as a smaller, more appropriate alternative. Andrew refused. The king cannot evict Higham without igniting a legal and public relations nightmare. And so, in the middle of Windsor Park, a man without duties or public role continues to live in royal comfort, his mansion paid for, his position untouchable, his silence absolute. Royal Lodge has become more than a residence. It's a parable of power without consequence. Its lawns are kept, its staff retained, its security quietly funded, though no one will say by whom. Officially, Andrew covers the costs. Realistically, that claim is hard to believe. The upkeep of such an estate runs into hundreds of thousands per year. For a man with no visible income, it's an arithmetic problem that only royal accounting can solve. For the monarchy, the optics are disastrous. At a Thank You when ordinary Britons are struggling with rent and energy bills, one of the most disgraced royals in modern history lives in near palatial seclusion. Every photograph of those iron gates is a reminder that the system protects its own, not by grace, but by structure. The monarchy may speak of modernization, but its machinery remains medieval. Loyalty to blood, secrecy in finances, immunity by inheritance. Royal Lodge sits in the heart of Windsor Park like a sealed chamber, legally impenetrable, morally indefensible. It is what happens when privilege outlives purpose. The walls that once symbolized royal gentility now echo with a different sound, the quiet hum of scandal that refuses to fade. And for King Charles, that silence may be louder than any public protest. Because no reform, no speech, no gesture of charity can erase the image of one man, stripped of honor, yet sheltered by law. Looking out from 30 rooms he will never have to surrender. In that single contradiction lies the monarchy's deepest dilemma: mercy without justice, loyalty without accountability. A system too ancient to punish itself. Every institution has its ledgers, but the monarchies are written in disappearing ink. What the public sees, the sovereign grant, the glossy annual reports, is merely the surface layer, a performance of transparency. Beneath it lies a network of financial arrangements so intricate, so carefully structured, that even Parliament has never fully mapped it. To understand how the Windsors sustain their empire, One must look not at the palaces themselves, but at the numbers that surround them, or rather, the numbers that never appear. In the fiscal year of 2022 to 2023, the sovereign grant, the portion of Crown estate profits paid to the monarchy, amounted to £86.3 million. It funds official travel, staff, and maintenance of royal palaces. On paper, it looks accountable, but the grant excludes the single largest expense: security. Those costs are classified under national security, buried in Home Office and Metropolitan Police budgets, invisible to the public eye. Independent analysts estimate the total at somewhere between £100 and £200 million annually. Money spent without debate, oversight, or disclosure. Then there are the duchies, Lancaster and Cornwall, medieval estates that function as private investment empires for the sovereign and the heir. The Duchy of Lancaster, the King's personal estate, brings in around £24 million per year. The Duchy of Cornwall, now controlled by Prince William, roughly the same. Neither pays corporation tax. Both are exempt from capital gains tax. Each claims to be private, yet exists solely because of royal position, inherited through blood, protected by custom, and managed through opaque structures that would make any corporate accountant blush. When Charles renovated Highgrove, duchy funds paid the bills. When William refurbished Anmer Hall, the same pattern repeated. In any other context, such an arrangement would be considered public money redirected for private luxury. But here, it's simply tradition. The distinction between public and private royal spending has always been elastic. When a palace is used for state events, taxpayers cover its upkeep. When it's used privately, personal funds, often derived from duchy revenues, pay instead. But those funds themselves come from lands and investments that owe their existence to the monarchy's constitutional privilege. It's a circular system where public wealth is laundered into private comfort through the language of heritage. And then there's inheritance. In 1993, the British government quietly agreed that transfers of property between monarchs would be exempt from the 40% inheritance tax faced by every ordinary citizen. That means when Queen Elizabeth passed Sandringham and Balmoral, properties worth over £1 billion combined, to her son, no tax was due. When Charles passes them to William, the same exemption will apply. Generation after generation, royal wealth compounds untaxed, untouched, and unexamined. It is the ultimate example of how privilege perpetuates itself, not through conspiracy, but through paperwork. Add it all together: the duchies, the grant, the invisible security budget, the untaxed inheritances, and the monarchy's real annual cost becomes unknowable. Estimates range from £300 to £500 million per year, but no one can confirm because the full data doesn't exist. Or rather, it exists, just not for public eyes. For the monarchy, this secrecy is not merely convenient, it is existential. Full transparency would reveal that what the public believes it funds for tradition's sake is, in practice, a sprawling network of estates, trusts, and exemptions sustaining a private dynasty. And once seen plainly, that system would be politically indefensible. The monarchy's survival depends on the polite fiction that its wealth is symbolic, not systemic, that its palaces are national treasures, not family assets. But numbers, unlike crowns, do not lie, they only hide. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the Windsors no longer need to conceal their wealth through force or deception. They do it through complexity, layers of law, centuries of precedent, and a public too weary or too reverent to keep asking questions. It's not corruption in the cinematic sense. It's something subtler, and in many ways more effective. The quiet transformation of inherited privilege into an accounting category so intricate that no one can untangle it. And maybe that is the most enduring monarchy of all, not of crowns and castles, but of clever paperwork that keeps the past permanently profitable. When Charles ascended the throne, the word he chose most often was modernization. He promised a slimmed-down monarchy, fewer working royals, fewer expenses, a cleaner break from the perception of extravagance. The problem is, sliming down an image is easier than sliming down a system. For the monarchy, property is not an accessory. It is its backbone. Every reform that triumphs ceremony but preserves the estates changes the window dressing, not the room. Charles's challenge is one his mother never faced. The age of data. Queen Elizabeth ruled through deference and mystique. The public asked fewer questions, and those who did rarely found answers. Charles reigns in a Britain of collapsing trust, where journalists, economists, and even loyal royalists can cross-reference land registries and tax records with a few clicks. Promises of transparency sound hollow when the palace still refuses to publish full accounts of Balmoral, Sandringham, or the duchy's holdings, even the sovereign grant. The most visible form of royal funding is presented as generosity, a repayment to taxpayers for services rendered, when in truth it is the dividend of a centuries-old property monopoly, dressed in constitutional language. The king's greatest irony is that he genuinely believes in reform, high groves, organic gardens, his climate initiatives, his insistence on sustainability. All reveal a man convinced that moral renewal is possible. But moral renewal cannot coexist with structural opacity. You cannot champion green living from a £1 billion estate exempt from property tax. You cannot preach moderation when your own family holds 30 properties across the United Kingdom. And yet, Charles cannot dismantle what he inherited without dismantling himself. The crown binds its wearer as tightly as it privileges Higham. Then there is William, the heir raised in the shadow of public adoration and scrutiny alike. His speeches on homelessness, mental health, and community resonate with sincerity, but sincerity alone cannot outshine contradiction. Anmer Hall, Kensington Palace, Adelaide Cottage. These are not symbols of modesty, no matter how carefully they're photographed. As Prince of Wales, William now oversees the Duchy of Cornwall, an estate of nearly 130,000 acres that earns millions annually. He speaks of empathy for those priced out of housing, yet profits from one of Britain's largest property portfolios. It's not hypocrisy, it's the quiet bind of birthright. Every good intention becomes entangled in the very privilege it seeks to soften. The monarchy's modernization is, in truth, a masterclass in rebranding. Public access to the gardens here, a televised charity gala there, a photo of a royal driving an electric car, all gestures of normalcy that conceal the persistence of extraordinary privilege. The narrative of reform comforts the audience, but changes nothing fundamental. The palaces remain, the duchies thrive, the secrecy deepens. In that sense, Charles and William are not reformers but caretakers, preserving the illusion of progress to delay the reckoning that transparency would bring. And perhaps the palace understands this better than anyone. The monarchy's power no longer lies in its ability to command, but in its ability to distract, to make the public admire the pageantry while ignoring the paperwork. Every ribbon cutting, every solemn balcony wave, every carefully staged moment of relatable royalty is a sleight of hand, a way to say, "Look here," while the real empire remains hidden behind the velvet curtain. It's not malice, it's survival. For centuries, the monarchy has endured by adapting its mask. Divine right became tradition. Tradition became service. Service became charity. But beneath every transformation, the same estate ledger endures. And if Charles and William cannot change that ledger, modernization remains exactly what it has always been. A word spoken to reassure the governed that the system which governs them is still somehow moral. For centuries, the monarchy has thrived on a simple truth, that as long as the public never saw the full picture, they would accept the frame. Buckingham Palace could glitter, Balmoral could brood, and Sandringham could charm, as long as each estate felt like a separate chapter in a romantic national story. But now, in an era of collapsing trust and widening inequality, that illusion is beginning to fray. The British public is starting to ask not what the monarchy symbolizes, but what it costs. And that, more than any scandal or misstep, is what could bring the system to its knees. Today, Britain faces its worst housing crisis in generations. Nurses line up at food banks. Rent consumes half of a young family's income. Meanwhile, one family holds over 30 residences, many unused for most of the year, maintained by a patchwork of public funds and tax exemptions. It is not envy to notice the contrast. It is arithmetic. Charles promised a slim-down monarchy, but his reign has revealed a different reality. A property empire so vast that even its owners cannot occupy it all. When a nation must choose between heating and eating, the idea of paying for palatial heating bills becomes untenable. For now, secrecy still protects the crown. The sovereign grant disclosures are designed to look transparent, offering annual reports with polite graphs and smiling photos. But what they omit, the full costs of security, staff, maintenance, and inheritance, is precisely what matters most. It's a performance of accountability, not the practice of it. Every missing number is a quiet act of preservation, shielding the monarchy from its own modern relevance test. Because the moment those numbers are revealed, the myth of self-sufficiency collapses. Yet the reckoning may not come from outrage alone. It may come from logic. As governments struggle to justify austerity, as tax reform becomes unavoidable, the monarchy's exemptions will start to look less like respect and more like loopholes. The younger generations, less deferential and more data literate, will not be satisfied with royal mystique as a defense for economic disparity. When the spreadsheets and satellite images of vast estates begin to circulate, when the invisible becomes visible, tradition will start to look like indulgence. Even within the palace, there are whispers of unease. Courtiers understand that public patience is not infinite. The days when charm and ceremony could obscure reality are numbered. A single parliamentary inquiry, one demand for a full audit, could shift the conversation irreversibly. It would not take rebellion, only revelation. The moment Britons see the entire royal property portfolio laid out, every acre, every exemption, every unseen mansion, the question will no longer be, do we support the monarchy? But why do we need it? Create. The monarchy's greatest defense has always been sentiment, that Britain would somehow be less itself without its sovereign. But sentiment cannot pay for security, or fund upkeep, or justify billion-pound estates in a country where the average citizen can barely afford a mortgage. The reckoning, when it comes, will not arrive as anger in the streets, but as a quiet shift in common sense. A nation simply deciding that reverence no longer makes fiscal sense. Because institutions do not fall when they are hated, they fall when they no longer make sense to those who maintain them. And the British monarchy, an empire of stone and secrecy, is reaching the point where even its justifications sound like relics. In the end, It may not be scandal or rebellion that ends it, but arithmetic, a simple, unanswerable question whispered by a taxpayer looking at 30 royal homes, why every empire ends the same way, not with the crash of thunder, but with the quiet sound of people turning away. The British monarchy will not be abolished by decree, nor dismantled overnight. It will fade by inches, undone not by outrage, but by indifference. The palaces will still stand, the portraits will still hang, but the awe will drain away, replaced by the quiet knowledge that the crown's wealth was never mystical, only material. And once a people begin to see their monarchs as landlords, not legends, the spell is broken. When Charles inherited the throne, he also inherited something far more fragile, a faith held together by habit. For decades, the monarchy survived because it felt harmless, a pageant of continuity that gave Britain a story to believe in. But the world that story was written for no longer exists. The cost of living has made reverence expensive. Tradition has become a tax category. Even the word heritage, once romantic, now sounds like a subsidy. And so the crown faces its oldest and most dangerous question. What purpose does it serve? The truth, of course, is complicated. The monarchy still draws tourists, still anchors Britain's soft power, still provides comfort to those who cherish its rituals. But its deeper power, the unspoken idea that royal wealth is somehow separate from worldly inequality, cannot survive modern light. You cannot preach service while living behind 30 locked gates. You cannot ask for loyalty when your fortune is hidden from those who pay for it. The monarchy's real problem is not moral failure, but moral mismatch. An institution built for feudal deference existing in a democratic age that insists on receipts. One day, perhaps not soon, but inevitably, a future government will demand full disclosure. Every property, every trust, every exemption will be laid bare. And when that happens, Britain will have to look at what it's been protecting and decide whether it still believes in it, because the royal mansions that dot the map are more than symbols of the past. They are mirrors of the present, reflecting what a nation chooses to tolerate in the name of tradition. In the end, the crown's greatest weakness is not scandal or politics. It's arithmetic. A family that owns 30 homes in a country where millions own none cannot claim moral authority forever. And when that contradiction becomes too heavy to carry, the monarchy will fall not with anger, but with logic. Quietly, inevitably, like a curtain lowering on a story that went on too long. In the end, every empire leaves behind not just monuments, but questions. The Windsors houses will outlast us all. The granite walls of Balmoral, the red brick of Sandringham, the endless lawns of Windsor. They will remain as the weather changes and the years pass, silent witnesses to the long experiment of monarchy. Yet stone endures only when the story behind it still makes sense. And that story of service, sacrifice, and symbolic leadership is beginning to sound uncertain in the echo of its own halls. What began as divine right became tradition. Tradition became ceremony. Ceremony became habit. And habit, when left too long unquestioned, becomes entitlement. That is the quiet danger of history, that reverence hardens into reflex, and privilege disguises itself as continuity. The monarchy still calls itself a symbol of unity, but unity built on secrecy cannot hold forever. You can't preserve mystique in an age of receipts. You can't claim humility from behind 30 gates. And you can't call a house a home when its cost is silence. Still, there is something haunting about these estates, their beauty undeniable, their emptiness instructive. They remind us that wealth without meaning is only weight, and tradition without truth is only theatre. The British Crown may survive this century, but only if it learns to tell the truth about itself, because every gate locked to the public is one more wall between the monarchy and the people it claims to represent. This is old Thank You Aim Docs. And tonight, as we leave the marble corridors and shuttered drawing rooms behind, the question lingers in the cold air outside. What is legacy worth when it must be hidden to survive?